The train came late into Brethren Creek on the last Tuesday of October 1878, dragging behind it a long scar of coal smoke that hung in the autumn air like a bruise across the Colorado sky. The platform was no more than a strip of warped pine boards set between two mud ruts that passed for streets, and the mountains rose behind the town like the shoulders of something ancient and indifferent. The San Juan Range did not care who came or went. It only watched. When the locomotive shuddered to a halt and the brakeman threw the lever, three passengers stepped down. A drummer with a sample case and a limp, a cattle broker in a bowler hat who squinted at the thin air like a man who had never breathed above 5,000 feet, and a girl. She was small. That was the first thing anyone would have noticed had anyone been watching. 5'2", at most slight in the shoulders, narrow at the waist, with hands that looked as if they had been made for work, finer than whatever life had given her. Her dress was cream white, the kind of dress a woman might choose for a journey that mattered, but the hem was brown with dust and the lace at the cuffs had come loose on one side. Her hair, the color of honey left too long in the sun, fell in loose waves around a face shaped like a heart, and her eyes were green. How the dull green of river water, but the sharp, startling green of new leaves after rain, the kind of eyes that made a man look twice and then look away, because something in them felt too honest to hold. She carried a leather valise in one hand cracked along the spine and held shut with a strip of rawhide, and in the other hand she held a letter. The paper had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had gone soft as cloth and the ink had smudged at the corners where her thumb had pressed during the 6 days she spent on trains crossing from Nevada to Colorado. The letter was the only piece of mail she had ever received in her 20 years of living, and she held it the way some people hold a candle in a dark room. Not because it gave much light, but because without it, there would be none at all. She stepped onto the platform and looked around. Her green eyes swept the empty stretch of boards, the mud street beyond the false-fronted buildings with their painted signs already peeling in the mountain wind. She looked north toward the peaks where the first snow had already fallen and the ridge lines cut against the sky like the edge of a dull blade. No one was there to meet her. She did not call out. She did not ask the brakeman or the station agent or the drummer with the limp if anyone had come looking for a girl off the afternoon train. She simply walked to the single wooden bench that sat beneath the overhang of the station roof, set her valise beside her, and sat down with the letter in her lap. The station agent, a man named Pruitt with a tobacco-stained mustache and kind enough eyes, came out when the platform was empty and the train had pulled away in a billow of steam. He looked at her. She did not look back. He asked if she needed help. She did not answer. He asked again, louder, leaning closer, and she turned her face toward him with an expression that was not fear and not confusion, but something quieter than both. She held up the letter. Pruitt took it, unfolded it carefully, and read the name written at the top in a hand that was strong but not elegant. Ridley Dunmore, the Dunmore Ranch, North Mountain. He handed the letter back and shook his head. The Dunmore brothers did not come down often, he told her. Storm had been on the mountain for 3 days. Could be another day or two before the trail cleared. She would have to wait. He brought her a wool blanket before he locked the station for the night. The kind of blanket that smelled of horse and old smoke, and he left a tin cup of water on the bench beside her. She thanked him with her eyes only. Not a nod, not a gesture, just a look that passed between them and settled like dust. Elowen Pardee sat on that bench through the night. She did not sleep. She watched the stars come out above the San Juan peaks, thick as scattered salt, and she listened to the sounds of Brethren Creek settling into darkness. A dog barking 3 streets over. A piano from the saloon, tinny and distant. The creak of a signboard in the wind. She heard all of it. She heard everything. She always had. But she did not make a sound. 2 weeks before that night on the platform in a dying mining town in the Nevada desert where the buildings leaned like drunks and the wells had gone dry, a man named Harmon Pardee sat in a saloon that had more dust than whiskey and placed an advertisement in the Weekly Circular. The notice read in letters misspelled in two places: young girl obedient, deaf and dumb, needs good family ready for wife or housework, inquire urgent. It was not the first time he had tried. He had placed similar notices in two other towns over the past year, but no one had answered. A mute girl with no dowry and no family name worth speaking was not a commodity that moved fast, even on the frontier where women were scarce and men were desperate. Harmon did not think of his daughter as a commodity exactly. He did not think of her much at all. She was a problem he had inherited from his first wife, a silent woman named Delia, who had died of lung sickness when the girl was 12, and the problem had only grown since. The girl did not speak. She did not respond when spoken to. She moved through the house like a ghost, cooking, cleaning, mending, and watching him with those green eyes that seemed to see through the back of his skull. He did not like being seen. What Harmon did not know, what no one in the world knew, was that Elowen could hear perfectly well. Her ears worked as God had made them. Every word, every whisper, every curse he muttered under his whiskey breath reached her with perfect clarity. She had simply stopped answering. The silence had been her mother's idea. Delia Pardee, born mute, had never spoken a word in her life, but she had been fluent in the language of survival. When Harmon began drinking heavily in the winter of '66, and when the drinking turned to hitting, Delia understood before anyone else what was coming. She could not protect herself. She could not scream, could not call for help, could not test to feed, but she could protect her daughter. On a scrap of paper torn from the back of a hymnal, Delia wrote the words that would shape the rest of Elowen's childhood. If you do not hear, he will not hit you for what you hear. From that day forward, Elowen stopped responding to sound. She trained herself not to flinch at slammed doors, not to turn at shouted names, not to react when bottles shattered against walls 3 feet from her head. She learned to keep her eyes unfocused, her face blank, her body still. She became invisible. Delia died on a cold night in December when Elowen was 12. She died in the single bed they shared, and Elowen lay beside her and listened to her mother's breathing grow shallow and irregular, and then stop, and she did not cry, because crying made sound, and sound was dangerous. She lay there until morning with her hand on her mother's chest, feeling the warmth leave by degrees, and when Harmon finally came in and found them, Elowen was staring at the ceiling with dry eyes, in a silence so complete that he muttered something about the girl being simple and walked away. After Delia's death, Elowen kept the silence. It was the only inheritance her mother had left her, and she wore it like armor. 6 years she lived in that silence, cooking for a man who forgot to feed her, cleaning a house that fell apart around them, and waiting without knowing what she was waiting for until the letter came. The letter had been written by a man named Ridley Dunmore, who lived on a ranch in the mountains above Brethren Creek, Colorado, with his two brothers. Ridley had found Harmon's advertisement in a newspaper that his hired hand, a cowboy named Orrin Polk, had brought up the mountain to line his boots against the cold. The paper was 3 weeks old, and the advertisement was buried between a notice for horse liniment and a legal summons for a man who had skipped town. But Ridley's eyes caught on two words and could not move past them. Deaf and dumb. His mother had been mute, born that way, lived that way, died that way. Her name was Fable Dunmore, and she had raised 3 sons on a mountainside without ever speaking a word, communicating instead through a private language of hand signs and written notes and a vocabulary of touch that her boys understood better than English. She had died 10 years ago in the small room off the kitchen in the bed, where she had slept alone since her husband's death 2 years before, and she had died because her eldest son had made a decision that he would carry in his chest like a stone for the rest of his life. Ridley wrote the letter not because he wanted to buy a woman. The thought turned his stomach. He wrote it because those two words, deaf and dumb, cracked something open in him that he had spent a decade sealing shut. And he thought with the desperate illogic of a lonely man that perhaps somewhere in the world there was someone else who understood what silence meant, who lived inside it the way his mother had, who might hear the things that could not be said aloud. He sent money for a train ticket. He sent it to the address listed in the advertisement, intending it for the girl. Harmon intercepted the envelope, pocketed the money, and put Elowen on the next westbound train, with nothing but the valise and the letter and a shove between the shoulder blades that she felt for 300 miles. By the time Ridley Dunmore rode down to Brethren Creek to collect her, she had been sitting on the station bench for 31 hours. He arrived on horseback at mid-morning, a full day late. The mountain storm had washed out a section of the trail above the tree line, and he had spent the better part of a day rerouting through a canyon that added 6 miles to the descent. He was tired and muddy and angry at himself for the delay, though his face showed none of it. Ridley Dunmore's face did not show much of anything. It was the face of a man who had learned early that expression was a kind of exposure, and exposure on a mountain could kill you. He was tall. That was the second thing anyone would notice after the stillness. 6 feet and 6 inches of height, with shoulders wide enough to fill a door frame and hands that looked as if they had been designed for breaking rock. His hair was chestnut brown, streaked lighter at the temples from years of sun, and his eyes were the color of whiskey, held up to firelight, amber and sharp and watchful. He had a guignon that could have been cut from the same granite as the mountains behind him, shadowed with 2 days of stubble, and a nose that had been broken once long ago, leaving a slight bump at the bridge that kept his face from being handsome in the easy way and made it handsome in the hard way instead. He wore no gun belt. He carried a rifle in the saddle scabbard, but his hands were empty when he swung down from the horse and walked to the platform where the girl sat wrapped in a wool blanket with her valise at her feet. He stopped 6 feet from her. He removed his hat. He said his name. Eloan Pardee looked up at him, and whatever Ridley Dunmore had expected to see in the face of a deaf girl sold by her father, it was not what he found. There was no desperation in those green eyes, no pleading, no relief. She looked at him the way a person looks at a horizon, steadily, without expectation, measuring the distance between where she was and where the sky began. He told her his name again, slowly facing her so she could read his lips if she needed to. He told her about the ranch, about the mountain, about the 3-hour ride ahead. She did not react. She did not nod or shake her head or blink. She simply looked at him, and then she stood, picked up her valise, and followed him to where his horse waited. He had brought a small wagon, hitched behind the horse, anticipating luggage. There was only the valise. He placed it in the wagon bed and offered his hand to help her climb up. She looked at his hand, large and callous, scarred across the knuckles from years of fence wire and axe handles, and for a moment something flickered in her eyes, not fear, something closer to recognition. Then she took his hand light as a leaf and stepped up into the wagon without a sound. The ride up the mountain took 3 hours and 12 minutes. Ridley spoke occasionally short sentences offered into the silence like stones dropped into a well waiting for an echo that never came. He told her the name of the creek they forded. He pointed out the aspens turning gold on the south-facing slopes. He mentioned that the weather would clear by nightfall. She sat behind him in the wagon bed, with her face turned to the wind, watching the mountain open up around them, and she said nothing. But there was a moment, a small thing that would matter later, though neither of them knew it yet. When the wagon rounded a sharp switchback near the top of the canyon, the trail narrowed and the left wheel caught a rut, and Ridley pulled the reins hard to keep the horse steady. In the same instant, before the wagon lurched, Eloan reached out and gripped the sideboards with both hands. She braced herself a full second before the jolt came, as if she had known it was coming, before the wheel hit the rut, before the horse stumbled, before the physics of the thing had played out. Ridley did not notice. He was watching the trail. But the moment hung in the air behind them like a held breath, and later, much later, he would remember it and understand. The Dunmore Ranch sat on a shelf of flat land carved into the north face of the mountain, 1,500 feet above Brethren Creek, in a place where the wind never fully stopped, and the sky was so close you could almost hear it thinking. The main house was built of lodgepole pine, dark with age, with a slanting roof and a porch that wrapped around 3 sides and looked out over a valley so wide and empty that the first time a man saw it, he usually forgot what he was going to say. There were outbuildings, a stable, a chicken coop, a smokehouse, a root cellar dug into the hillside, and beyond the buildings pasture land that rolled down toward the tree line, where a herd of 40 cattle grazed on the last of the autumn grass. 3 men had built this place, and 3 men kept it, and they had done it alone for 10 years. When the wagon cleared the last switchback and rolled into the yard, two of those men were waiting on the porch. Though waiting was not exactly the right word. Beckett Dunmore was splitting firewood beside the porch steps, shirtless, despite the October chill driving the axe into rounds of pine with the kind of force that suggested he was not thinking about firewood. Ansel Dunmore was brushing down a sorrel mare near the stable door, moving the brush in slow circles with the absent gentleness of a man whose mind was quieter than his hands. They stopped when the wagon appeared. They looked at the girl, then they looked at their brother. The three of them were identical. Not similar, not resembling, but identical in the way that only nature's most precise accident could produce. The same height, the same breadth of shoulder, the same chestnut hair, the same amber eyes, the same hard jaw and broken nose, the same scars on the same hands. Standing together, they looked like three versions of the same man cast from the same mold, tempered by the same fire, separated only by the invisible architecture of the souls inside them. Brethren Creek called them the three ghosts of the mountain. They came down so rarely and looked so alike that the townspeople had stopped trying to tell them apart and simply referred to them as the Dunmore Brothers Plural Collective, as if they were a single creature with 6 legs and 3 hearts. Beckett set the axe down. His face, which was the same face as Ridley's and Ansel's, went hard. He looked at the girl in the wagon, then at Ridley, and his voice came out flat and sharp like a nail driven wrong. "What in the hell did you do?" Ridley climbed down from the driver's bench. He explained. He did it the way he did most things, directly, without apology, without softening. He had written a letter. He had answered an advertisement. The girl's name was Elowen. She was deaf and mute. He intended to marry her. Beckett stared. Then he laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has just been told that the ground he is standing on is made of paper. "You have never managed to talk to a woman for 10 minutes straight," he said, "and now you want to marry one who cannot talk at all." Ansel said nothing. He stood by the stable door with the brush still in his hand and watched the girl in the wagon bed with an expression that neither of his brothers could read. Something had shifted behind his eyes when Ridley said the word deaf, and it had not shifted back. Ridley helped Elowen down from the wagon. She stood in the yard of the Dunmore Ranch with her valise at her feet and her letter in her hand, and looked at the 3 identical men arranged before her, each one massive and watchful and wearing the same face with a different weather behind it. And she did not flinch. She did not shrink. She stood the way a person stands at the edge of a river they have decided to cross, knowing the water is cold and the current is strong, and there is no bridge, and choosing to step in anyway. Ridley led her to the small room off the kitchen, the room where Fable Dunmore had slept and died. He did not tell her that. He set her valise on the bed and showed her the wash basin and the lamp and the window that looked out toward the stable, and then he left her alone. The argument that followed played out that evening after supper in the main room of the house, while Elowen sat in the small bedroom with the door half open and her hands folded in her lap. She could hear every word. Beckett was against it. His objections were practical on the surface and terrified underneath. Bringing a stranger up the mountain was dangerous. They had built their life on isolation and routine, and the understanding that the only people they needed to trust were each other. A woman would change the balance. A woman who could not communicate would be a burden. A woman who showed up with a single valise and no family and no history was a risk he was not willing to take. What Beckett did not say, what he could not have said because he did not have the vocabulary for it, was that he was afraid, not of Elowen, of what Elowen might see. Beckett Dunmore had built a wall around himself out of anger and noise, and behind that wall he kept the one thing he could not face. 10 years ago he had killed a man, a horse thief who had come at Ansel with a knife near the creek crossing. Beckett had pulled his revolver and fired. The shot was clean. The man dropped. The sheriff in Brethren Creek ruled it self-defense, and that was the end of it, except that Beckett knew the truth. He had fired before he needed to. He had fired not because Ansel was in danger, but because the rage in him had found a target and for one white-hot second he had wanted to kill. Not defend, kill. That distinction lived inside him like a splinter of bone too deep to extract, and every day since he had wrapped himself in belligerence to keep anyone from pressing close enough to feel it. Ansel said nothing during the argument. He stood by the window of the main room, arms at his sides, and watched the shapes of the conversation move between his brothers without joining. Ansel was the quietest of the three, which in a family of quiet men was saying something. He had a way with animals that bordered on conversation. Horses would calm under his hands. Dogs followed him without being called. He had once sat motionless for 20 minutes beside a wounded elk until the animal allowed him to splint its leg a feat that the ranch hands talked about for months. But with people, Ansel was lost. He had loved a girl once, Emmeline Cross, the school teacher's niece from Brethren Creek. He was 23. She was pretty and quick to laugh, and she had kissed him once behind the feed store on a Saturday afternoon, and for 3 days afterward, Ansel had walked around in a daze of happiness, so unfamiliar that he kept checking his own pulse to make sure he was not running a fever. Then, Emmeline had learned that he and his brothers lived alone on the mountain, 3 unmarried men in a house with no woman, and her face had changed. 3 wild animals up on that ridge, she had said to her aunt, loud enough for half the store to hear. No decent woman would set foot up there. Ansel had not spoken to a woman outside of commerce since. Now he stood at the window and watched Elowen through the half-open door. He watched the way she sat very still, very contained with her back straight and her hands in her lap and her eyes cast down in a posture of such practiced invisibility that it made his chest ache. He knew that posture. He had seen it in horses that had been broken too hard. The animal that holds perfectly still is not calm. It has simply learned that movement brings pain. The argument ended without resolution. Beckett went to his room, Ridley went to the porch, Ansel stayed at the window and watched the girl in the dim light of the kitchen lamp, and he thought she walks like something that has been hunted, and the thought settled into him and would not leave. Ella went alone in the small room off the kitchen, the room where Fable Dunmore had slept and died, stood before the old mirror on the wall. The glass was clouded with age, and the reflection it offered was more suggestion than portrait, a pale shape with green eyes and honey-colored hair, standing in a dead woman's room in a house full of strangers on a mountain she had never seen. She touched the wall. The wood was smooth where hands had pressed against it for years. She touched the quilt on the bed. She touched the dresser, the lamp, the windowsill. She was memorizing the room with her fingers, the way her mother had taught her to memorize any new space, because in the dark your hands are your eyes. She lay down on the bed without removing her shoes. This was habit. This was 6 years of sleeping in a house where the front door could open at any hour with a man's heavy footsteps and whiskey on the air. She slept with her shoes on because shoes meant running, and running meant surviving, and surviving was the only verb she trusted. In the morning, things began to change. The 3 brothers came down to the kitchen at dawn and found it transformed. The fire was burning steadily in the stove. Coffee was brewed strong and black in the tin pot. Biscuits sat on a plate beside a jar of honey that Elowen had found on the top shelf of the pantry behind a sack of flour and a tin of baking soda. Bacon was crisping in the skillet. The kitchen table, which had been covered in old newspapers and tack hardware, and a lantern with a cracked chimney, was cleared and wiped, and set with 3 plates and 3 cups and 3 forks aligned with a precision that bordered on ceremony. Elowen stood by the stove with her back to them. She did not turn when they entered. She did not flinch at the sound of their boots on the pine floor because she was not supposed to hear boots on pine floors. And the performance of deafness required absolute consistency. Ridley sat down first. He looked at the coffee, the biscuits, the cleared table, and something in his face shifted. It was not a smile. Ridley Dunmore did not smile often. It was more like the easing of a muscle that had been clenched for years, a loosening so slight that only someone paying very close attention would have noticed it at all. He reached into the cabinet above the sink and brought out a small slate board and a piece of chalk, the kind school children use for arithmetic. He set them on the table in front of the empty 4th place and tapped the slate with his finger. Then he said slowly, facing Elowen so she could read his lips, and Elowen looked at the slate. She looked at the chalk. She looked at Ridley. Then she crouched beside the table and wrote in a slanting hand that was surprisingly elegant for a girl who had never been to school. The letters leaned slightly to the right as if reaching for something just out of sight. Elowen. Ridley read it aloud. He said the name once, testing the shape of it in a house that had only known the sound of men's voices for a decade. Then he said it again softer, as if giving it permission to stay. Beckett stood in the corner of the kitchen with his arms crossed and his face set. He did not sit. He did not eat. He watched the girl in the slate, in his brother's face, in his jaw work beneath the stubble, like a man chewing on something he could not swallow. Ansel ate quietly and watched Elowen move around the kitchen. She had found everything without being shown. The coffee tin, the flour bin, the cast iron skillet hung on the third hook from the left, the honey on the top shelf. She had navigated a strange kitchen in darkness before dawn, and she had done it as if the room itself had whispered its secrets to her. On the third day, Ansel brought Elowen to the stable. He had noticed her standing at the kitchen window each morning, looking out toward the barn, with an expression he could not read but could not ignore. Something in the way she watched the building, the slight forward lean of her body, the way her fingers pressed against the glass as if trying to reach through it, told him that whatever was pulling her attention toward the stable was not idle curiosity. In the last stall on the right, a bay mare stood alone. Ridley had bought her cheap at the Brethren Creek auction because she was lame in the left foreleg and prone to biting. In the 2 weeks since, no one had been able to get close enough to examine the injury. The mare would flatten her ears and snap at any hand that came near, and even Ansel, who could gentle most animals with patience and touch, had given up after she nearly took a piece out of his shoulder. Elowen walked into the stall. Ansel reached for her arm to pull her back, but she was already past him, moving with a kind of calm deliberation that he had never seen in a person approaching a dangerous animal. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. She walked as if the space between her and the horse was not empty air, but a bridge, and she was simply crossing it. The mare pinned her ears. Her nostrils flared. She shifted her weight onto her hindquarters, loading the spring. Elowen stopped. She stood 3 feet from the animal and did nothing. She did not extend her hand. She did not make soothing sounds, which would have betrayed her anyway. She simply stood very still and breathed. 30 seconds passed. A minute. The stable was silent except for the sound of hay settling and the wind moving through the gaps in the planking. Then the mare's ears came forward. Her nostrils relaxed. She lowered her head by an inch, then 2, and let out a long breath through her nose that sounded to Ansel's experienced ear like surrender. Elowen raised one hand. Slowly, palm up, fingers relaxed. She placed it on the mare's shoulder. The horse did not move. Elowen ran her hand down the animal's flank, along the barrel of her ribs, down to the swollen foreleg. She knelt. She wrapped the leg with a strip of cloth she had brought from the kitchen, working with the kind of steady, unhurried touch that Ansel had spent his whole life trying to master. The mare stood still. She did not bite. She did not kick. She stood as if she had been waiting for exactly this, for hands that knew how to listen. Ansel stood in the stable doorway with his mouth slightly open and his hands hanging at his sides. He had worked with horses for 20 years. He had been born on this mountain and raised by a woman who communicated through touch, and he had inherited her gift and refined it and made it the center of his life. And he had never in all his years seen anything like what he was watching now. That night in the dark of the bunk room where he and Ridley slept on opposite sides of a plank wall, Ansel said quietly, "She hears something we do not hear." Ridley did not answer, but his silence had a different quality than usual. It was the silence of a man who is beginning to believe something that he cannot explain. 2 weeks passed, then 3. Elowen settled into the rhythm of the ranch the way water settles into a creek bed, finding the low places, filling the gaps, moving without friction. She cooked. She cleaned. She tended a small herb garden that she planted from wild roots she dug up on the mountainside yarrow, and sage and mint and feverfew arranged in neat rows behind the kitchen. She lined the chicken coop with pine needles. She mended fences with wire and pliers in hands that were small but exact. Every evening she wrote notes on the slate board beside the kitchen table. Bacon low, dog limping, wind smells like snow. No one asked how she knew the wind smelled like snow. They simply noticed that when she wrote it, snow came. 3 men lay in the dark that night, each one thinking about the same woman, though none of them would have admitted it in daylight. Ridley thought, she is like my mother, silent and patient and strong in the way that no one sees. And the thought was both comfort and knife because he had failed his mother, and the possibility that he might fail again sat in his chest like a coal that would not go out. Beckett thought, she knows too much. She is dangerous. But for the first time in 10 years, there was someone in the house who he did not have to perform for. She could not hear his words, or so he believed, which meant he did not have to guard them. And the relief of that, the terrible relief of being near someone who he thought could not hear his lies, was so sweet that it frightened him more than the knowing ever could. Ansel thought, she is beautiful in the moonlight, and he hated himself for thinking it because she was his brother's intended bride, and he had no right, and he knew it. But deeper than the guilt and the longing, he thought about the way she had walked into the stall with the bay mare, about the way the animal had yielded to her, about the way her hands had moved over the swollen leg with a confidence that came from somewhere beyond training or practice. He thought about the word he had used in the dark. She hears something we do not hear, and he wondered what else she might be hearing that none of them suspected. The moon climbed above the peaks. An owl called from somewhere in the spruce grove north of the stable, a single low note that carried on the still air like a bell ringing once in an empty church. The wind moved through the spruce and the pine and the bare aspens and across the porch where a woman's footprints were still pressed into the frost, and it carried with it the scent of something clean and cold and ancient. The silence held, but it was no longer empty. It was filling slowly and invisibly with the weight of things unsaid and secrets kept, and the first fragile stirrings of a trust that none of them had earned yet, but all of them in their separate darknesses were beginning to reach for. And in the small room off the kitchen in the bed where Fable Dunmore had taken her last breath 10 years before Elowen Pardee lay with her shoes still on and her eyes wide open and listened to the house breathe around her. She heard the wind, she heard the settling timber, she heard Ridley's slow, heavy breathing through the wall and the creak of Beckett's bunk as he turned in the far room and the faintest sound of Ansel's footsteps as he crossed the back porch and stood in the darkness, looking out at the mountains the way a man looks at a question he does not know how to answer. She heard all of it, every sound in that house, every breath and creak and whisper. And she kept her silence because silence was the only armor she had ever owned. And she did not yet know if these men, these 3 identical strangers with their mother's ghost still living in the walls, were the kind of people who would make it safe to set that armor down. But something in her, something small and stubborn and green as her own eyes, something that had survived 6 years of silence and a father's fists and a mother's death, and 300 miles of train track between one life and whatever came next, that something whispered to her in the dark, in a voice so quiet it might have been her own heartbeat. Wait, listen, they are not him. And Elowen Pardee, who had spent 8 years pretending not to hear the world, heard that whisper and held it close and did not let it go. The afternoon that changed everything came without warning, the way most things on a mountain do. It had been raining for 3 days. A steady autumn rain, cold and persistent, the kind that turned the trails to mud and made the creeks rise and kept the cattle huddled under the tree line with their backs to the wind. Ridley and Beckett were not concerned. October rain was ordinary. The mountain collected water and released it slowly through 100 small drainages that fed the valley below. And in 17 years of living on this land, they had never seen the water become something to fear. Elowen was in the yard washing clothes in the wooden tub Ridley had set up beside the well. The rain had paused, though the sky was still low and gray, and the air had the heavy waiting quality of a storm that was resting, not finished. She was wringing out a shirt, her small hands twisting the wet fabric with a practiced efficiency when she stopped. Her hands froze around the cloth. Her back straightened. Her chin lifted, and her eyes, those green eyes that missed nothing and revealed less, turned slowly toward the east, toward the narrow canyon where a small creek ran through the lower pasture where the cattle grazed. She stared at the canyon for 3 seconds. Her nostrils flared slightly, as if she were breathing something the air itself was trying to tell her. Then she dropped the shirt into the mud and ran. Not walked, ran, barefoot across the yard through the gate, past the chicken coop, and into the stable where Ansel was forking hay into the feed troughs. She seized the sleeve of his shirt and pulled hard enough to spin him around. He stumbled, caught himself on the edge of the trough, and looked at her face. It was white beneath the freckles, white in a way that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with something he had seen only once before in a horse that had smelled a mountain lion on the wind. Her free hand pointed east toward the canyon. Her mouth was open but making no sound. Her body was vibrating. She pulled again toward the door. Ansel let himself be pulled. She dragged him out of the stable, then released him and ran to the main house where Ridley was working at the desk in the front room. She burst through the door and seized his wrist and hauled him to his feet with a strength that seemed impossible for a girl her size. Ridley came up out of his chair with the paper scattering and the inkpot tipping sideways, and the look on his face shifting from surprise to something sharper as he read the urgency in her eyes. Then she found Beckett. He was in the lower pasture, crouched beside a sick calf, checking its eyes and its breathing, with the grudging tenderness he showed only when he believed no one was watching. Elowen grabbed his sleeve and pointed east and made a gesture with her hands that none of the brothers had ever seen before. She slapped her palms together, then flung them apart, then slapped them together again over and over, fast and desperate. The motion was raw and unschooled, and it did not come from any language they knew. It came from the place where language breaks down and the body takes over. Water. Water coming down. Ridley looked at the canyon. The creek was running normally, maybe a little high from the rain, but nothing unusual. Nothing that would explain the terror on the face of the girl standing before them with mud on her bare feet and her chest heaving. Beckett folded his arms across his chest. She is panicking over nothing, he said. The girl is touched. But Ansel looked at her eyes. He did not see panic. He saw certainty. The flat, absolute certainty of a creature that knows something the world has not yet announced. It was the same expression he had seen in animals before earthquakes, before lightning strikes, before avalanches. Not fear, but knowledge. The deep body-level knowledge of something wrong that had not yet arrived but was already on its way. Move the cattle up to the high ground, Ansel said. Now, Beckett wanted to argue. His mouth opened and his jaw set, and the word no was already forming behind his teeth. But Ridley was already moving, and when Ridley moved, the others followed because that was the order of things and had been since they were boys. The eldest led, the others came after. It was not discussed or debated. It simply was. The three brothers drove the herd up the slope to the ridge above the pasture, 40 head of cattle, bellowing and stumbling through the mud, their hooves churning the wet earth into a slurry that sucked at boots and made every step an act of will. Elowen ran alongside them barefoot in the rain, her cream dress now brown to the knees, her hair plastered to her face and neck, slipping on the wet grass, falling once hard enough that she went down on both knees and both palms, and rising without pausing, without checking for injury, without breaking stride, as if the ground itself had told her there was no time to stop. 40 minutes after they cleared the last animal from the lower pasture, the mountain broke open. The sound came first. A low rumble that built from somewhere beneath the earth, deep and grinding like thunder, dragged along the ground by something massive and blind. Then the wall of water appeared at the head of the canyon, brown and churning, and 20 feet wide, and carrying with it mud and rock, and uprooted trees and fence posts, and everything else the mountain had been holding back for 3 days. The debris flow hit the lower pasture like a fist driven into the belly of the land. It tore through the fences. It buried the grass under 4 feet of mud. It swallowed the creek crossing in the feed shed in the corner of the pasture where the sick calf had been standing 20 minutes before. If the cattle had been down there, the Dunmore brothers would have lost everything. Every animal, every dollar of income, every chance of surviving the winter. Beckett stood on the ridge in the rain and watched the brown water churn through the valley below. His arms hung at his sides and his jaw was slack, and the rain ran down his face and into the collar of his shirt, and he did not move. Then he turned and looked at Elowen. She stood 10 feet away, soaked to the skin, her hair in dark ropes against her cheeks, her bare feet sunk in the mud to the ankles, and her eyes were calm. Calm in a way that did not make sense. Calm in a way that made the hair on his arms stand up. "How did you know?" he said. His voice was hoarse. The words came out rough and cracked, the voice of a man whose certainties have just been rearranged. She did not answer. She turned away from him and walked back toward the house, leaving small footprints in the mud that the rain erased behind her. That night, for the first time since she arrived, Beckett did not say a word against Elowen Pardee. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time after supper, staring at his own hands, and what he felt was not gratitude and not suspicion, but something far more unsettling. He felt exposed, not by anything she had said or done, but by the possibility that she could see inside him, that those green eyes which seemed to hear the mountain itself might also hear the thing he had buried so deep that even his brothers did not know it was there. He went to bed without speaking and lay in the dark and listened to the wind, and for the first time in 10 years, the silence felt like someone else was listening back. 1 week later, a quiet night. Stars above the peaks like holes punched in a dark cloth, letting through the light of whatever burned on the other side. Elowen sat on the front porch, wrapped in the wool blanket from her first night, and watched the moon rise over the San Juan Range. Inside the house, the three brothers were in their separate corners, each one occupied with a small tasks that filled the hours between supper and sleep. Ridley was reading. Beckett was sharpening a knife. Ansel was oiling a saddle. An owl called from the timber, a single note low and resonant from somewhere in the spruce grove north of the stable. The sound carried on the still air, clear and solitary. Elowen turned her head toward it. It was a small movement, reflexive, unconscious. The automatic response of a person who hears a sound and turns to locate its source. It lasted less than a second, and then she caught herself and went still again, her face going blank, her eyes returning to the moon as if the movement had never happened. But Ansel saw it. He was standing in the shadow of the back door, unable to sleep, watching the night the way he often did when the quiet inside the house grew louder than the quiet outside it. He was leaning against the door frame with his arms folded and his face turned toward the darkness, and he saw her head turn. He saw the reflex. He saw her catch herself and go still. His heart beat faster. He pressed his back against the frame and closed his eyes. She could hear. He was certain of it. He had spent his life reading the involuntary language of animals, the twitch of an ear, the dilation of a pupil, the shift of weight that preceded a bolt. The movement he had just seen was involuntary. A person who cannot hear does not turn toward a sound. A person who is pretending not to hear turns toward the sound and then stops, and the stopping is what betrays them because the body knows what the mind is trying to hide. She had heard the owl and her body had responded before her discipline could stop it. Ansel did not tell his brothers. He stood in the dark for a long time thinking, and what he decided was this. If she had chosen silence, she had a reason. And whatever that reason was, it belonged to her. He had no right to take it from her. He had no right to expose her. He had no right to decide for her when or how or whether she would let the world hear her voice. It was not his secret to take. He went back to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around him. Through the wall, he could hear Ridley breathing. From the far room, the creak of Beckett shifting in his bunk. And from the kitchen, the faintest whisper of movement. Elowen rose from the porch and went inside and closed the door to her small room with a care so practiced that it made no sound at all. Three men lay in the dark that night, each one thinking about the same woman. Ridley thought, she is like my mother, silent, impatient, and strong in the way that no one sees. And the thought was both comfort and knife because he had failed his mother, and the possibility that he might fail again sat in his chest like a coal that would not go out. Beckett thought, she knows too much, she is dangerous, but the relief of being near someone who could not hear his lies was so sweet that it frightened him more than the knowing ever could. And Ansel thought, she is beautiful in the moonlight, and he hated himself for thinking it because she was his brother's intended bride, and he had no right, and he knew it. But deeper than that, deeper than the guilt and the longing, he thought about the secret he now carried. She can hear. She hears everything. And she chose silence anyway. And he felt, without being able to name it, that in the moment she turned her head toward the owl's cry, she had trusted him with something precious, even though she did not know he was watching. The moon climbed above the peaks. The owl called again and was answered from somewhere deeper in the timber. And the wind carried with it the scent of snow, exactly as she had written on the slate that morning. 2 months passed on the mountain, and in that time the ranch changed in ways that none of the three brothers could have predicted, and none of them fully understood. It was not the large things. The house still stood where it had always stood. The cattle still grazed the same pastures, the fences still needed mending, and the woods still needed splitting. It was the small things, the things that accumulated like snow on a fence rail, weightless individually, but transformative in some. The kitchen was the center of it. Elwyn had claimed it without asking, the way water claims a dry riverbed, simply by flowing into the space and staying. She rose before dawn every morning, and by the time the first gray light crept across the valley, the stove was hot, the coffee was brewed, and the kitchen smelled of something that none of the brothers could name, but all of them recognized. It smelled like being cared for. She cooked the way she did everything else quietly and with a competence so thorough that it seemed less like skill and more like instinct. She had never been taught. No one had shown her how to season a cast iron skillet, or how to stretch a pound of flour into enough bread for 4 people, or how to make venison stew from scraps and wild herbs in the memory of hunger. She had learned it the way she had learned everything, by watching, by listening to the world with senses that went deeper than hearing, by understanding what was needed before anyone said it aloud. The herb garden behind the kitchen grew. She dried the excess on racks she built from willow branches, hanging bundles of lavender and chamomile from the rafters of the back porch until the air around the house smelled different, softer, like something remembered from childhood that you could not quite place. Ridley began teaching her sign language. He had learned it from his mother Fable, who had been born mute and had communicated her entire life through a private vocabulary of hand signs that she and her husband had developed together over 20 years of marriage. After Fable died, Ridley had not used the language. There had been no one to use it with. His brothers knew a few signs of the basics: water, fire, come here, danger. But the nuance had faded the way a path fades when no one walks it. Now he sat at the kitchen table with Elwyn in the evenings and taught her sign by sign, word by word. Water. He cupped his right hand and tapped his chin. Fire. He flicked his fingers upward. Thank you. He touched his lips and extended his hand outward. His hands were too large for grace. His fingers were thick from years of rope and wire and axe handles, and the signs he made looked clumsy compared to the fluid shapes his mother had produced. But Elwyn was patient. She took his hands in hers, her small fingers wrapping around his large ones, and guided them into the correct positions with a gentleness that seemed to come from somewhere very old and very deep. When he got it right, she smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, gone almost before it arrived, but it was the first smile Ridley had seen from her, and the effect it had on him was disproportionate to its size. It felt like someone had opened a window in a room that had been sealed shut for 10 years, and the air that came through it was cold and clean and almost painful in its freshness. Ansel taught her to ride. She had never sat a horse before. He could tell by the way she approached the animal, respectful but uncertain. the way a person approaches a river they have never forded. He chose the gentlest horse in the stable, an old gray gelding named Parson, who had not spooked at anything since the summer of '62, and he saddled him with a patience that bordered on ritual. The first time Aloan put her foot in the stirrup and pulled herself up, her hands gripped the saddle horn so tightly that her knuckles went white and her face lost all color. She sat rigid in the saddle, every muscle locked, breathing in short, shallow gasps. Ansel walked beside the horse, one hand on the bridle, and talked to her in a low, steady voice. He knew she could hear him. He had known since the night of the owl, and he talked to her not in words that meant anything in particular, but in a tone that meant everything. He told her about his mother, how Fable used to stand in the stable door at dusk and watch the sunset with her hands pressed flat against the doorframe, as if she could feel the light fading through the wood. How she communicated with the horses, not through voice or sign, but through a kind of silence so complete that the animals seemed to enter it the way they entered a still pool, calmly, trustingly, without resistance. He told her about the loneliness, about the years since Emmeline Cross had called them wild animals and walked away, and how those words had lodged in him like a fishhook and pulled a little tighter every year. He told her that some nights he lay awake and listened to the wind and imagined that it was speaking to him in a language he could almost understand, and the almost was the worst part because it meant the silence was not empty. It was full of things he could not reach. He said these things because he believed or pretended to believe that she could not hear them. And the freedom of that belief, the freedom to speak without consequence, without the risk of being heard and judged and found wanting, was so sweet and so dangerous that he could not stop. He poured words into the space between them like water into a cup, and she sat on the gray horse and moved with the animal's rhythm, as if she could feel its heartbeat through the saddle, and she gave no sign that she heard a single syllable. But she heard everything, every word, every confession, every shattered piece of loneliness that Ansel Dunmore laid at her feet without knowing he was doing it. And something inside her, something that had been shut tight since the night her mother died, began very slowly to open. Beckett kept his distance. He was civil with Elowen. He said good morning and passed the salt and nodded when she set his plate in front of him. But he did not sit with her, did not seek her out, did not allow himself to be alone in the same room with her for more than the time it took to cross it. He watched her from the periphery, the way a man watches a fire he is not sure he can control. One evening while Beckett was outside checking the stock, Elowen wrote something on the slate board and left it on the kitchen table where he would see it when he came in. The handwriting was careful and the letters were round, and the sentence sat alone in the center of the dark slate like a single star in an empty sky. You do not need to be afraid. I do not judge anyone. Beckett read it standing in the kitchen doorway with his boots still on and his coat still buttoned. He read it twice. He stood there for a long time, long enough for the fire in the stove to burn down to coals and the kitchen to grow cold around him, his hands gripping the edges of the table, his jaw working beneath the stubble, and in his chest the splinter of bone that had been lodged there for 10 years shifted. Just slightly, just enough to hurt in a new way, in a way that felt less like damage and more like something trying to heal. He did not erase the slate. He left it there. And in the morning when Elowen came down to start the coffee, she saw that it had not been wiped clean, and she understood that Beckett had read it and that he had not known what to do with what he found. On a cold afternoon in December, Ridley rode down to Brethren Creek for supplies. He returned 3 hours later with the wagon loaded and his face carrying a weight that had nothing to do with flour sacks and fence wire. Sheriff Haddon Pratt had pulled him aside outside the general store. Pratt was a careful man, neither brave nor cowardly, the kind of lawman who kept the peace by avoiding conflict rather than confronting it. He had hemmed and hawed and looked at his boots and finally asked Ridley a question that sounded casual, but carried the weight of something much heavier. "How did your mother die, Ridley?" Someone has been asking. Ridley had not answered. He had loaded his wagon and driven away without a word. But the question had opened a door he had spent 10 years nailing shut, And now the draft from that door was blowing through him cold and relentless and smelling of February. Fable Dunmore had died on a February night in 1868. She had been sick for weeks, a cough that deepened into something wet and heavy, a fever that came and went like a tide that would not decide whether to stay or go. The boys were 23. Their father had been dead for 2 years. Ridley was the eldest by 7 minutes, and in those 7 minutes lived the weight of every decision that followed. The snow that February had been the worst in memory, drifts as high as the stable roof, temperatures that froze water in the kettle overnight and turned the air itself into something that burned the lungs. The trail down to Brethren Creek was buried under 6 feet of white, and the only way out was on horseback through a canyon that had killed 2 men the winter before. Fable could not tell them how sick she was. She could not say the words, "I need a doctor," or "I am afraid," or "Please take me down the mountain before it is too late." She wrote notes, but the notes said only, "I am fine," and "Do not worry," because she was a mother, and mothers do not burden their children with the truth when the truth is too heavy for young shoulders. Ridley saw the blood on her handkerchief. He saw the way she braced herself against the door frame when she stood, her knuckles white, her body swaying. He knew she was not fine, but the canyon was dangerous, and the storm was not breaking, and his 2 brothers were depending on him to make the right decision. And the right decision, the safe decision, the responsible decision was to wait. He waited. Fable died at 3 in the morning, while all 3 sons slept in their beds, and when Ridley found her at dawn, she was cold, and her face held an expression that he would see every night for the rest of his life. Not pain, not accusation. Peace, the terrible peace of a woman who had died alone because her son had chosen caution over love. That evening, Ridley sat on the front step of the ranch house and watched the sun set behind the western ridge. The sky was the color of a bruised purple and yellow, and edged with a darkness that seemed to seep upward from the mountains like something rising from deep water. He did not speak. He did not need to. The silence around him was thick with the things he could not say, and anyone standing near enough would have felt the weight of it pressing against their skin. Elowen came out. She stood beside him on the step, close enough that he could have reached out and touched her shoulder without extending his arm. She did not touch him, and he did not reach. She simply stood. For 5 minutes, for 10, for the time it took the last sliver of sun to disappear behind the ridge, and the first stars to come out above the peaks, she stood beside him in silence. And her silence was not empty. It was the silence of a person who is listening truly, listening not for words, but for the thing beneath words, the frequency at which pain vibrates when it has been held too long and has nowhere left to go. Then she placed her hand on his shoulder. It was a small hand, calloused at the fingertips, scarred at the wrist, where rope had bitten into skin years ago, and it rested on his shoulder with a weight that was barely there and absolutely there at the same time. Ridley spoke without looking at her. His voice was low and rough and directed at the ground between his boots. "My mother was sick. I was afraid of the storm, so I did not take her down the mountain. She died in the night alone, in the room where you sleep now." He said it to the ground because he could not say it to a face. And he said it because he believed she could not hear, and the luxury of confession without audience was something he had needed for a decade and never allowed himself. Elowen could not respond with words. She was still Elowen, the deaf girl, still bound by the armor her mother had given her. But she lifted her hand from his shoulder and placed it on his chest over his heart and held it there. She felt the beat of it beneath her palm, steady and heavy, the heartbeat of a man carrying a weight that was slowly crushing him from the inside. Then she went into the house, into the small room off the kitchen, and she came out holding something, a handkerchief, blue faded, trimmed with hand-stitched lace so fine it looked like frost on glass. She had found it wedged between the floorboards under the bed in a crack where it had slipped years ago and been forgotten by everyone except the ghost of the woman who had carried it. Fable's handkerchief. The one she had carried in her apron pocket every day, the one she had pressed against her mouth when the coughing became too much, the one that had been missing since the day she died. Elowen placed it in Ridley's hand. She closed his fingers around it gently, the way you close a child's hand around a gift. And then she turned and walked back into the house and left him sitting on the step with his mother's handkerchief in his fist and the last light dying on the ridge. Ridley sat there until the moon came up, and for the first time in 10 years, tears ran down the weathered planes of his face, silent, unchecked, the tears of a man who had forgotten that his body still knew how to cry. Word travels strangely in mountain towns. It moves not through newspapers or telegraph, but through the accumulated weight of small observations, a glance exchanged across the counter, a sentence begun and abandoned, a silence that lasts a beat too long. By the end of November, Brethren Creek knew about the girl on the mountain, and what they knew had begun to frighten them. It began with Orrin Polk. The cowboy had wrenched his shoulder pulling a calf from a mud bank, and the doctor in Brethren Creek was 3 days east on a house call. Orrin rode up to the Dunmore Ranch because he had heard from no one he could name that the girl up there had a way with injuries. Aloan examined his shoulder in the stable yard. She ran her hands over the joint without hesitation, without asking where it hurt, without pausing to consider. She pressed once hard in a spot that Orrin had not identified as the source of the pain, and the shoulder popped back into alignment with a sound like a walnut cracking. Orrin sat on the fence rail for 10 minutes afterward, moving his arm in slow circles with his mouth open and his eyes wide. He told the story at the saloon that evening. The girl did not ask where it hurt, he said. She just touched it and knew. 2 weeks later, the Morrison boy fell sick. 6 years old, bright-eyed, quick to laugh, and then overnight he was burning with fever, his small body rigid, his eyes rolled back, his skin the color of tallow. His mother sent for the doctor. The doctor was still east. She sent for the midwife. The midwife came, took one look, and shook her head. Odette Scholl, the widow who lived nearest the Dunmore property, rode up the mountain and begged. She stood in the yard with her hat in her hands and her voice breaking. Ridley looked at Elowen. Elowen looked back. She did not nod. She did not need to. She picked up the small leather bag she had begun carrying, filled with dried herbs from her garden, and walked to the wagon. In the Morrison house, in the back bedroom, where the bee lay in a narrow cot with sweat soaking the sheets and his breath coming in thin, rattling gasps, Elowen knelt beside him. She placed one hand on his chest and one hand on his forehead and closed her eyes. She stayed like that for nearly a minute, perfectly still, as if she were listening to something inside the child that no one else could detect. Then she opened her eyes, stood, and walked out to the garden behind the house. She cut lavender from a bush near the fence. She pulled feverfew from between the flagstones. She gathered wild thyme from the ditch beside the road. Back inside, she steeped the herbs in hot water, strained the liquid through a cloth, and held the cup to the boy's lips with the patience of a woman who had spent her whole life waiting. By midnight, the fever had broken. By dawn, the boy was sitting up asking for breakfast. His mother fell to her knees in front of Elowen and held the girl's hands and wept with a gratitude so raw it filled the room like heat. But by that afternoon, the whispers had already started. She did not ask what his symptoms were. How did she know? How did she know what herbs to use? How did she know where to put her hands? How did she know? Sunday morning. The church in Brethren Creek was a small white building with a crooked steeple and windows that let in more cold than light. Pastor Aldrich Creed stood at the pulpit. He was a tall man, thin as a fence post, with deep-set eyes and a voice that carried the particular authority of a man who had confused his own bitterness with divine conviction. His daughter, a girl named Patience, had left home 2 years before without explanation, and since that day, Creed had been slowly calcifying his sermons, growing harder, his mercy growing thinner, his need to condemn the broken things in others, growing in direct proportion to his inability to face the broken thing in himself. There is a girl on the mountain, he said. The congregation went still. She does not speak. She does not hear. But she knows things that only the Lord or his adversary could know. She heals sickness without asking its name. She predicts weather before the sky changes. She touches animals and they obey her as if she speaks their language. He paused. His eyes swept the faces of his congregation. The Dunmore brothers have brought something down from that mountain man, and we must face it before it takes root among us. Nell Firth, who owned the general store and whose opinion carried the weight of unofficial law in Brethren Creek, nodded from the third pew. When Nell nodded, the town nodded with her. She was a hard woman, fair in her dealings, but unyielding in her judgments, and she had survived enough to trust her instincts above all else. Her instincts told her that a mute girl who could heal fevers and predict floods was not natural, and what was not natural was dangerous. 10 days after the sermon, 12 people stood at the gate of the Dunmore Ranch. They had not brought torches. They had not brought guns. They had brought something more dangerous than either the collective certainty of a community that had decided what it feared and needed a face to pin the fear to. Beckett came out first. He walked down the porch steps with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his hat pushed back and his eyes flat. The revolver was on his hip, but his hand was nowhere near it. "What do you want?" he said. Pastor Creed stepped forward. His coat was buttoned to the throat, and his Bible was tucked under one arm, and his face had the fixed quality of a man who has rehearsed his righteousness. "We want the girl gone," he said. "She does not belong here." Ridley appeared behind Beckett, unarmed, his hands at his sides, his voice low and steady as the bedrock beneath their feet. "She is my intended wife. This is my land. You have no claim here. She is a witch," a woman in the back of the group shouted. "She knew that boy was sick before he got sick." Ansel was the last to appear. He stepped into the doorway of the house and stood there, filling it with his height and his quiet, and he did not carry a weapon, and he did not raise his voice. He spoke in a tone that was almost gentle, and for that reason it carried further than anything his brothers had said. "She is the only person I have ever known who truly listens," he said. "Not with her ears, with her hands, with her breath, with her whole soul." He looked at them one face at a time, and each face he looked at flinched. "I have lived 33 years," he continued, "and I can count on one hand the number of people who have truly heard me. Not just my words, but my silences, my regrets, my grief. She does all of that without saying a single thing." He let the words settle. Then he said, "You want to drive someone out because she is different, because she sees the world you are too afraid to face. Fine, but you will have to come through all three of us." The three brothers stood shoulder to shoulder on the porch. Three identical men, massive, unmoving, their amber eyes catching the last of the evening light. Three sons of the mountain who had been born together and raised together and forged by the same loneliness into something that could not be broken by 12 frightened people with their certainties and their pastor and their need to punish what they could not understand. The crowd shifted, feet shuffled, eyes dropped. One by one they turned and walked back down the trail toward town until only Creed remained standing at the gate with his Bible under his arm and his jaw tight. "This is not finished," he said. Then he too was gone. The aftermath of the confrontation settled over the ranch like the silence after a gunshot. For 3 days, none of the brothers spoke of it. They went about their work with the grim efficiency of men who have drawn a line and know it will be tested again. But on the fourth morning, Ridley woke to find the kitchen dark and the stove cold, and Elowen gone. Her shoes sat on the front porch side by side, lined up with the same precision she brought to everything. She had gone out barefoot. They found her a quarter-mile west of the house on the slope of a rocky hill that none of them had ever paid much attention to. Thin soil over granite, the kind of terrain that grew scrub brush and nothing else. The sort of place a rancher glances at and dismisses. Elowen was kneeling, both palms pressed flat against the frozen ground, her arms extended to her forehead, nearly touching the earth. Her eyes were closed. The morning frost had turned the grass around her white, and she knelt in the center of it, like something planted there, rooted and still, and belonging to the ground in a way that humans are not supposed to belong to the ground. Ridley crouched beside her and touched her shoulder. Her skin was cold through the thin fabric of her dress. She opened her eyes and looked at him, And in that look, there was something he had not seen before. Not the calm observation he was used to, but a focus so intense that it seemed to go through him and into the earth beneath them both, as if she were hearing something deep below the surface that required every part of her to receive. She stood. She picked up a stone and placed it on the earth where her right hand had been. Then she walked 20 paces west, knelt again, pressed her hands to the ground, and placed another stone. She did this 4 times, creating a line of 5 stones that ran straight across the hillside from east to west. Ridley signed the question. Water Elowen nodded. Beckett, who had followed at a distance, made a sound between a laugh and a cough. That hillside is dry as a bone, he said. There has never been water there. Even the old man never found water on that slope. Ansel was already walking back to the stable. He returned with 3 shovels. Beckett stared at him. You cannot be serious, he said. Ansel handed him a shovel. It costs us nothing to dig, he said. Ridley took the 3rd shovel. After a moment of standing with his jaw working and his eyes hard, Beckett spat in the dirt and drove his own shovel into the ground with a force that was more fury than faith. They dug all day. The ground was rocky and stubborn, and every foot of depth had to be fought for. Elowen sat on a boulder nearby and watched with her hands in her lap, and if she was nervous or uncertain, she did not show it. At 4 feet, Beckett's shovel struck something that was not rock. The sound changed. The resistance changed. The ground was damp. At 4.5 feet, water began to seep into the hole, first as a dark stain spreading through the soil, and then as a trickle, and then as a steady flow that filled the bottom of the excavation and rose to cover their boots. Clear water, cold water, water that tasted when Ansel cupped his hands and brought it to his lips like mountain snow and granite in the deep, clean darkness of the earth's own veins. The spring was strong, stronger than the old well that fed the ranch, stronger than the creek that fed the town. It was an underground river, a vein of snowmelt that had been running through the mountain's bones for 1,000 years, invisible and silent, and Elowen Pardee had found it by kneeling in the frost and pressing her palms to the frozen ground and listening. This was not a small thing. For 3 weeks, the main well that served both the Dunmore Ranch and Brethren Creek had been drying up. The autumn had been dry, the snowpack on the peaks was thin, and the creek that fed the valley was running at half its normal flow. 3 crews from town had tried to dig new wells in 3 separate locations, and all 3 had come up dry. Families were rationing water. Cattle were thinning. There had been talk, quiet but growing, of abandoning the town before winter sealed the passes. Orrin Polk carried the news down the mountain that evening. By the next morning, Sheriff Haddon Pratt was at the ranch gate, hat in hand, asking permission to run a pipe from the new spring to the town cistern. Ridley agreed without conditions. Water was water. A man did not attach terms to something the mountain gave freely. Nell Firth did not apologize. She did not retract her nod in the church or her whispered agreement that the girl was unnatural, but she stopped using the word curse. When someone mentioned it in her store, she cut them off with a sharpness that surprised even her. Water is water, she said, echoing Ridley without knowing it. Do not ask where it comes from. 2 weeks of uneasy peace, the water flowed. The tension receded like a creek after flood, pulling back from the high marks but leaving mud and debris on the banks. And then Harmon Pardee arrived. He came into Brethren Creek on a Tuesday afternoon riding a mule he had likely stolen, wearing a coat with one sleeve torn off and boots that were more whole than leather. He smelled of whiskey and road dust and the particular sourness of a man who has been running from himself for so long that he has forgotten which direction he started from. He tied the mule to the rail outside the saloon and asked in a voice loud enough to carry across the street which way to the Dunmore Ranch. Pruitt sent word up the mountain. By the time Sheriff Pratt escorted Harmon up the trail the following morning, Ridley was waiting on the porch with his brothers behind him and the rifle within reach. Harmon Pardee looked smaller than his cruelty suggested. He was a narrow man, stooped at the shoulders, with watery blue eyes and hands that shook from drink or withdrawal or both. He stood at the gate with the sheriff beside him and looked up at the three identical giants on the porch and produced a smile that was both ingratiating and menacing. The smile of a man who has spent his life finding the soft places in other people impressing. "My daughter," he said. "I have come for my daughter." Ridley came down the steps. His voice was the same low, steady tone he used for everything, whether he was discussing the weather or drawing a line that could not be crossed. "You sold her through a newspaper advertisement. You took the money I sent for her passage. You put her on a train with nothing but a torn valise and a letter. You do not have a daughter here." Harmon's smile widened. He had rehearsed this. "I did not sell her," he said. "I sent her to be wed, a father's prerogative. Now I have changed my mind. I want her back, or I want compensation for her loss." Beckett moved forward. His body preceded his words a step down, then another, his weight shifting in a way that Harmon recognized instinctively, because men like Harmon were experts at reading the signs of violence, having spent their lives both administering and avoiding it. But Beckett's voice was quiet, which was worse than shouting. "I have seen the scars on her wrists," he said, "where the rope was. I have seen the marks on her back that she tries to hide when she changes the bandages on the mare's leg. You want to talk about a father's prerogative? You do not have any prerogative at all." Harmon's smile thinned. He looked past the brothers toward the house where a curtain moved in the kitchen window. "My daughter," he called out. "Come here, girl. We are leaving." Elowen appeared in the doorway. She had heard everything. She had heard his voice on the trail before he reached the gate, had felt a particular frequency of fear that his presence had always generated in her body, the quickening of pulse, the tightening of throat, the instinct to shrink and disappear that she had spent 6 years perfecting. She stood in the doorway with her hands gripping the frame and her face white and her body trembling in a way that none of the brothers had ever seen. Ansel moved to her side. He placed his hand on her shoulder, steady and warm, and he did not speak. He simply stood beside her. A wall, a promise. Harmon took a step toward the porch. "Come on, you stupid girl," he said. "You are not worth the feed they are wasting on you." And then Elowen Pardee opened her mouth. The sound that came out was small. It was rough and broken and thin like a door hinge that has rusted shut from years of disuse being forced open for the first time. It cracked in the middle and wavered at the edges, and it was barely louder than a whisper, but it crossed the yard and hit every ear like a rifle shot. No, the word hung in the air. Ridley turned to look at her, his eyes wide, his hands frozen at his sides. Beckett stopped mid-step. Sheriff Pratt took a half-step backward. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the mountain itself had been waiting for this moment and wanted to hear what came next. Ansel closed his eyes. He exhaled slowly, and the breath left his body the way a weight leaves a man's shoulders all at once completely. He had known. He had known since the night of the owl that she could hear, and by extension, that she could speak, and he had carried that knowledge silently for weeks, respecting her silence, trusting her reasons. And now she had broken it. The armor her mother had given her, the shield of deafness that had protected her for 8 years, she had set it down. Here, now, in front of a man who had never deserved to hear her voice because the moment demanded it and she was done hiding. Elowen spoke again. The words came slowly, each one shaped with effort like stones being lifted from a well. She spoke in signs simultaneously, her hands moving through the air, while her voice, rough and cracked and barely used, filled the spaces between the gestures, and Ridley translated for those who could not read her hands, his own voice breaking as he did. "I can hear. I have always heard. My mother taught me to be deaf so that I could survive. If you do not hear, he will not hit you for what you hear. She died when I was 12. I kept the silence because it was the only thing she left me." Harmon Pardee's face went white. Then it went red, then the dark purple of a man whose last weapon, the assumption of his daughter's helplessness, has been taken from him in front of witnesses. "You," he said, "you little lying." Sheriff Pratt stepped between them. He was not a brave man, but he was not a fool, and he could see the trajectory of the moment with the clarity of a man who has spent his career reading the weather of human violence. That is enough, he said. The girl has made her choice. It is time for you to leave. Harmon looked at Elowin. He looked at the three men standing between him and his daughter. He looked at the sheriff whose hand had moved to rest on the butt of his revolver. And whatever calculation he was running behind those watery eyes, the answer came out the same way it always did for men like him. He turned. He walked back down the trail without a word, without looking back, without the dignity of a goodbye, because men like Harmon Pardee did not say goodbye. They simply left, and the wreckage they created was the only proof they had ever been there at all. That night, the four of them sat at the kitchen table. No fire in the stove, no lamp lit, just the blue light of the moon through the window and the four shapes of people who had been changed by what had happened and were still learning the shape of the change. Alowan picked up the chalk and wrote on the slate slowly, carefully, each letter formed with the deliberation of someone translating between the language of thought and the language of confession. My mother was mute. She taught me that silence was safer than speech. When my father drank, he hit her because she could not scream. She did not want me to be like her, so she taught me to be deaf so that I would not have to hear the things that would break me, or at least so I would not have to answer them. She paused. The chalk trembled in her fingers. But I heard everything, every night, every bottle breaking, every fist. I heard my mother take her last breath in the dark, and I did not move because moving made sound, and sound was dangerous. Silence was all I had. The kitchen was quiet, the kind of quiet that is not absence but presence, the presence of four people breathing together in a space that has suddenly become sacred. Beckett stood. He walked to the back door, opened it, stepped out onto the porch, and stood in the darkness for a long time. When he came back in, his eyes were red and his face was wet, and he did not try to hide it. He walked to where Elowin sat and placed his hand on top of her head. It was a gesture as old as fatherhood itself, and it looked strange coming from a man who had spent 10 years building a wall between himself and everything soft. But it was the gentlest thing he could think of, and he did it with a clumsiness that made it more honest than Grace could have. Ansel sat across the table and did not move. Tears ran down his face in the moonlight, steady and silent. Ridley took Elowin's hand. He looked into her eyes and signed with his free hand the signs his mother had taught him, the language of the only other mute woman he had ever loved. Here you can speak, he signed. Here you can be silent. Both are safe. Elowin looked at him, and for the first time since the night her mother died, she let the silence go. Not all of it, not yet, but enough to breathe. Later that night, long after the others had gone to their rooms, Beckett sat at the kitchen table alone. The moonlight had shifted, and the room was darker now, the corners filled with shadow. He heard footsteps. Elowin appeared in the doorway, barefoot, reaching for the water pitcher. They looked at each other across the dark room. Two people who had spent their lives building walls. Beckett spoke. His voice was low, barely above a whisper, as if the darkness required a different register. I killed a man, he said, not in self-defense. I told everyone it was, but it was not. A horse thief came at Ansel with a knife, and I had time to warn him, time to fire a warning shot, time to do 10 things that were not killing. But I wanted to kill him. I pulled the trigger because the anger in me found a target, and I let it. His hands resting on the table were shaking. You are the first person I have told. Elowin set the water pitcher down. She walked to where he sat and placed her hand on his. His hand was enormous beneath hers, calloused and scarred, the hand of a man who had used it for violence and spent a decade trying to forget. She did not speak. She did not sign. She simply rested her hand on his, and Beckett Dunmore breathed out in a way that he had not breathed in 10 years, as if something that had been pressed against his lungs had finally been removed. They stayed like that for a long time. Two people in the dark, connected by a touch that asked for nothing and offered everything. Elowin returned to her room. She stood at the window and looked out at the mountain night. For the first time since she had arrived, she did not pretend not to hear. She let the sounds come. The wind in the spruce, Ridley's voice low, talking with Ansel on the porch below her window. The steady rhythm of Beckett's axe because he had gone outside to split wood in the darkness. Each stroke regular as a heartbeat, each stroke releasing something that words could not carry. She heard the horses breathing in the stable. She heard the dogs shifting on the porch boards. She heard the creek diminished but still flowing, whispering over stones in the valley below. She heard the world, and for the first time in 8 years, she was not afraid of what it was telling her. The morning after Harmon Party disappeared down the mountain trail, Eloan Party spoke her first deliberate words to each of the three men who had become her world. She found Ridley in the stable at dawn brushing down the bay mare whose legs she had wrapped on her third day at the ranch. The mare was sound now, walking without a limp, and she nickered softly when Ridley entered her stall each morning, a greeting she offered to no one else except Eloan. He was running the brush along her flank in slow strokes, his back to the door, his mind somewhere far from the stable, when he heard footsteps behind him and turned. Eloan stood in the stable doorway. The early light came through the slats behind her and caught the edges of her hair and turned them to gold. And for a moment, she looked less like a person standing in a doorway and more like something the morning itself had placed there. She was wearing the cream dress she had arrived in, washed and mended so many times that the fabric had gone soft as cotton, and her feet were bare on the stable floor, and her hands were clasped in front of her the way they always were when she was about to do something that required courage. She opened her mouth. The words came slowly shaped with the kind of effort that made each syllable feel handmade, crafted rather than spoken. Because her voice had been unused for 8 years, and the muscles that produce speech had atrophied the way any muscle atrophies when it is not called upon. The sound was husky and rough and cracked at the consonants, and it was the most extraordinary thing Ridley Dunmore had ever heard in his life. "Thank you," she said, "for the letter." 3 words. Ridley stood holding the brush with his hand frozen in mid-stroke and his amber eyes fixed on her face, and he did not move. The bay mare turned her head and bumped his shoulder with her nose, impatient for the brushing to continue, and he did not notice. He was listening to the echo of her voice in the stable, the way it hung in the air between the hay bales and the saddle racks, and the dust motes turning in the early light, and he was thinking that he had written that letter on a cold night 6 months ago, with no expectation of anything, except the slim hope that somewhere in the world there was someone who understood silence. And now that someone was standing in front of him, speaking for the first time, and the first thing she had chosen to say was "thank you." He nodded. It was all he could manage, but the nod carried everything. She found Ansel next. He was on the ridge above the house, checking the fence line that ran along the northern boundary of the property, walking the posts the way he did every morning, testing each one with his hand, leaning his weight against them to feel for rot or looseness. He saw her coming up the slope and stopped. He waited. She climbed the last 50 yards in her bare feet, picking her way through the frost-covered grass with the sure-footed grace of someone who had learned to move without sound. She stopped 3 feet from him. The wind was blowing her hair across her face, and she pushed it back with one hand and looked at him with those green eyes that saw everything, and he felt as he always felt when she looked at him, simultaneously exposed and sheltered, as if her gaze was a place rather than an act. "I know you knew," she said. Her voice was stronger now, the second time easier than the first, though still rough at the edges, still carrying the texture of years of disuse, like silt in a river that has been still too long. "Since the night the owl called. I saw you standing at the back door. I know you saw me turn." Ansel's breath caught. He had not known that she knew. He had carried the secret of her hearing like a gift he had been given by accident, something precious and private, that he had no right to but could not put down. And now she was telling him that the secret had never been his alone, that she had known he was watching, known he had seen her reflex, known he had chosen to say nothing, and that his silence had been in its own way a form of trust as profound as her own. "You talk to the horses the way my mother used to," Elowen said. She paused. Then she added very quietly, I heard everything you said on those rides, about your mother, about being lonely, about the wind. Ansel looked at the mountains. He looked at the sky. He looked at the fence post his hand was resting on, and he pressed his palm against the rough wood and felt the grain of it under his skin, the way he felt everything through touch, through contact, through the surfaces of things. He did not cry because he had already cried the night before, but something in his face shifted and rearranged itself into an expression that was new, an expression he had never worn before, the expression of a man who has just been told that the words he threw into the void were not lost, that someone had caught them, that they had mattered. "Thank you," he said, "for listening." She found Beck at last. He was behind the smokehouse sharpening an axe on the whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of metal on stone filling the cold morning air, like the ticking of a clock that measured something other than time. He did not look up when she approached. He knew she was there. He always knew when someone was behind him, a reflex born from the same hypervigilance that had made him pull a trigger 10 years ago, the constant awareness that the world contained threats and that threats came from behind. Elowin stood beside the whetstone and waited until the scraping stopped. Beckett set the axe down. He still did not look at her. His hands resting on his knees were very still, the stillness of a man who is holding himself together by not moving. "I heard what you told me last night," she said. Her voice cracked on the word night, and she cleared her throat and tried again. "You are not a bad man." She paused, searching for the right words in a vocabulary that had been locked away for most of a decade. "A bad man does not carry what you carry. A bad man sleeps easy. You have not slept easy in 10 years. That is not guilt, that is conscience, and conscience is not punishment. It is proof that your soul is still alive." Beckett looked at her then, his amber eyes identical to his brother's, but carrying a different weather behind them, a weather of storms and wreckage, and the hard bright light that comes after met hers and held. His jaw worked, his throat moved. He did not speak, because the words she had given him had filled the space where his own words would have gone, and there was nothing to add that would not diminish what she had said. He picked up the axe. He set a new round of pine on the chopping block. He drove the blade down with a clean stroke that split the wood in two, and the sound of it rang out across the yard like a bell. And Eloan understood that this was his answer. The axe was his language. The work was his prayer. And the fact that he had let her stand beside him while he did it was as close to an embrace as Beckett Dunmore would ever come. In the days that followed, the ranch found a new rhythm. The chores were the same. The cattle needed feeding, and the fences needed mending, and the wood needed splitting, and the morning still came cold and bright above the peaks. But the texture of the days was different. The silence that had defined the household since Elowen arrived, the silence that had been her armor and her identity, and the only thing her mother had left her had been set aside, and in its place was something more complex. Not noise, not chatter, but the occasional extraordinary sound of Elowen Pardee voice. She spoke sparingly. Each sentence cost her visible effort, the words emerging from her throat like objects pulled from deep water, heavy and dripping, and strange in the light. Her voice had a quality unlike any the brothers had heard, low and textured, and slightly hoarse, with an accent that belonged to no particular region, because she had learned to shape words not from listening to conversations, but from listening to the world. Her vowels were round and her consonants were soft, and her sentences had a cadence that sounded less like English and more like the translation of a language that had no written form. She did not speak for the sake of speaking. Every word she chose to say had been considered, weighed, tested against the silence that preceded it. When she spoke, the brothers stopped what they were doing and listened, not because her words were important in the way that commands or warnings are important, but because they were rare, and rare things on a mountain are treated with reverence. Ridley and Elowen built their language together in the evenings by the fire. Sign and speech and silence wove together into a way of communicating that belonged only to them. He brought out books he had purchased in Brethren Creek, a tattered copy of Tennyson, a frontier almanac, a volume of natural history with illustrations of birds and plants. Elowen could read. Her mother had taught her tracing letters on the kitchen floor with a wet finger during the hours when Harmon was gone. But she had never read aloud, and the experience of doing so now, of sitting in a warm kitchen with firelight on the pages and three men listening, was so far from anything she had known that it felt like stepping into someone else's life and finding that it fit. Her voice reading Tennyson filled the kitchen with a sound that none of them had heard since their mother died. Fable had been mute, but every night the boys had read to her one chapter at a time, and she had sat in the rocking chair by the fire and followed the words with her eyes and smiled when the story turned toward kindness. Now Elowen sat in the same space and read in a voice that was broken and beautiful and wholly her own, and the three brothers sat and listened, and each one thought of their mother, and each one felt for the first time in 10 years that the house was full again. Beckett taught Elowen to shoot. He came to her one morning with a Henry rifle in one hand and a box of cartridges in the other, and said in a voice that made the offer sound like a commandment, "On this mountain, everyone knows how to protect themselves." Elowen looked at the rifle. She looked at Beckett. Then she nodded until they walked out to the flat ground behind the stable where he had set up a row of tin cans on a fence rail. He showed her how to hold the weapon, how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to breathe before squeezing the trigger. She was a quick study. Her hands were small but steady, and her eyes, those green eyes that missed nothing, found the targets with a precision that surprised even Beckett. By the third lesson, she was hitting 5 out of 6 cans at 50 yards. By the fifth, she was hitting all 6. But the lessons were about more than marksmanship. In the quiet minutes between rounds, while Beckett reloaded and Elowen stood with the rifle barrel pointed at the ground and the wind blowing her hair across her face, something happened between them that neither could have named. A warmth, a recognition. Two people who had survived violence and carried the scars of it in different places on their bodies and their souls, standing side by side in the mountain air, and discovering that the distance between them was smaller than either had imagined. Beckett did not tell her she was brave. He did not compliment her aim or praise her steadiness. He simply stood beside her and reloaded the rifle and set up the cans and let the rhythm of the work carry whatever it was he could not say. And Elowen understood because she had spent her life decoding the things people meant, but could not speak that this was Beckett's version of tenderness, and it was enough. Winter arrived with a ferocity that the San Juan Mountains were known for, but that Elowen had never experienced. The first real snowfall came in mid-December, 3 feet in a single night, turning the ranch into a white island surrounded by drifts that reached the bottom of the windows. The temperature dropped to 15 below, the creek froze. The world contracted to the space between the house and the stable, and the smokehouse, and beyond that perimeter, everything was white silence. Elowen had written on the slate 3 days before the storm, "Big one coming, move the hay inside." The brothers had learned by now not to question her weather predictions. When the snow hit, they were prepared. On the second morning of the storm, while the wind still howled and the snow fell in curtains so thick that the stable was invisible from the porch, Orrin Polk appeared at the ranch gate on a horse that was blowing foam and trembling. He had ridden through the blizzard for 3 hours, and his face was blue with cold, and his eyebrows were white with frost, and the first thing he said when Ridley dragged him inside and set him by the fire was not "thank you," but 2 words that changed the shape of the day. The boy, Whit Garvey's 7-year-old son of the blacksmith in Brethren Creek, had gone out to collect firewood at the edge of the tree line before the storm reached full force. He had not come back. His mother had found a single small boot at the edge of the forest, half buried in snow, nothing else. The men of the town had searched for 6 hours following tracks that the wind erased as fast as they were made, and they had found nothing. Orrin looked at Ridley and then past him to where Elowen stood in the kitchen doorway, and his meaning was as clear as the frost on his face. Elowen knew the boy's mother. She had seen her once in the general store, the day Nell Firth was still nodding at Pastor Creed's sermons. The woman had been standing near the flower display with Whit beside her, a small boy with red hair and a gap-toothed grin, and when Elowen had walked past, the woman had pulled her son behind her skirts with a quick furtive motion, shielding him from the deaf girl, the way one might shield a child from a dog of uncertain temperament. Elowen had not reacted. She never reacted. But she had seen the boy's face peering out from behind his mother's hip, curious and unafraid, and she had thought he is not the one who is scared. Now that same woman was somewhere in Brethren Creek on her knees in the snow, screaming her son's name into a storm that swallowed the sound before it traveled 10 feet. Elowen looked at Ridley. She did not need to speak. She did not need to sign. She simply looked at him, and he looked back, and the question and the answer passed between them in a language that required no medium except trust. Ridley nodded. They rode out into the storm, all four of them, Ridley and Beckett and Ansel and Elowen, on four horses with their heads bent against the wind and scarves wrapped around their faces and the snow driving into them horizontally like a wall of white needles. The trail down the mountain was buried. Ansel led because Ansel knew the terrain the way he knew the back of his own hand by feel and by memory, and by the instinct of a man who had spent his life listening to the land. They reached the edge of the tree line where the boy's boot had been found. The search party from town had given up an hour before driven back by the cold and the diminishing visibility and the growing conviction voiced by no one but shared by all that the boy was already dead. Pastor Creed had spoken the words that no one wanted to hear. It is God's will, he had said. We must accept. Elowen dismounted. She knelt in the snow and pulled off her boots and set them side by side in the white. Beckett said, "You will lose your feet." Elowen did not answer. She pressed her bare knees into the snow and her bare palms into the frozen earth, and the cold hit her skin like a blade, immediate and merciless. She pressed herself against the ground the way she had pressed herself against the hillside when she found the water, the way she had pressed her hands to the earth before the flood, with her entire body, with every nerve and every sense and whatever other faculty lived inside her that had no name and no explanation. The thing her mother had possessed and passed on to her like an inheritance more valuable than money or land or language. The ability to hear not sound but meaning, not noise but the deep, slow language of the world itself. The three brothers stood around her in a triangle shoulder to shoulder, their massive bodies forming a windbreak that cut the force of the gale. Snow accumulated on their hats and their shoulders and the horizontal planes of their outstretched arms, and they did not move. Three identical statues carved from stubbornness and devotion, sheltering a woman who was listening to the ground. 30 seconds. A minute. The wind screamed, the snow drove. The temperature was 12 below and dropping. Elowen opened her eyes. She stood. She pointed west. West was the direction the search party had not gone because west led into broken terrain, granite outcroppings, and deep ravines and deadfall timber, the kind of landscape that even experienced mountain men avoided in good weather, and that in a blizzard was a death trap with no door. Beckett shook his head. "That way is suicide," he said. Elowen looked at him. It was the same look she had given him before the flood, and before the water, and before every moment when her certainty had collided with his doubt. The look that was not a guess and not a hope, but a knowledge as deep and immovable as the mountain itself. Beckett held her gaze. Then he turned west. They walked. Elowen led barefoot in the snow, her feet turning red and then white, and then a color that Ansel did not want to look at, but could not look away from. He took off his coat and tried to wrap it around her shoulders, but she shook her head without breaking stride. She needed to feel the ground. The ground was talking to her, and she needed every nerve in her body to hear what it was saying. 3 miles. Through thigh-deep drifts and over ice-slicked granite, and between fallen trees that blocked the path, like the bones of something enormous that had collapsed and been forgotten by the world. Elowen moved through the storm with a sureness that defied explanation, turning left, then right, then straight, navigating not by sight, because visibility was less than 20 feet, and not by sound, because the wind obliterated everything, but by something else, something that lived in her palms and her soles and the marrow of her bones. They found him in a hollow beneath a fallen cedar, curled into a ball, with his arms wrapped around his knees and his face pressed into the collar of his coat. His lips were blue. His eyelashes were frosted. His small body was shaking in the violent mechanical way that the body shakes when it has used up everything it has and is running on nothing but the refusal to stop. Elowen dropped to her knees beside him. She gathered him into her arms and pressed him against her chest, wrapping her body around his the way a mother wraps a child, the way Delia had wrapped Elowen on cold nights in Nevada when the fire was out and Harmon was gone, and the only warmth in the world was the warmth of another person who loved you enough to give you the heat from their own body. Ansel stripped off his coat and wrapped it around both of them. Beckett built a fire in the shelter of the fallen cedar, his hands working with a speed and precision that burned through his gloves and left his fingers blistered, but produced a flame within 2 minutes, a small, bright defiance against the white dark. Ridley ran back through the storm to bring the horses closer. The boy opened his eyes. They were blue, unfocused, the eyes of a child who had been somewhere very far away and was not sure he had come back. He looked at Elowen, at her face, at her green eyes, inches from his own, and the first thing he said in a voice that was barely a whisper was, "She called me. I heard her calling my name." They brought him home. The ride back was longer and harder and colder than the ride out, and by the time they reached Brethren Creek, the boy was wrapped in every coat the brothers could spare, and Elowen was shaking so violently that Ansel had to hold her in the saddle in front of him, with both arms, his chest against her back, his body a furnace against her cold. Ridley rode ahead to bring the doctor. Beckett rode behind, watching the trail, guarding the rear because that was what Beckett did. He guarded things. It was the only way he knew to love. The boy's mother was waiting at the edge of town. She saw them coming through the snow, 4 riders in a small shape bundled in coats, and she ran. She ran through the drifts in her house shoes with her skirts held above her knees and her hair loose, and her face a mask of terror and hope. When Ansel handed the boy down to her, she collapsed in the snow with her son in her arms, and she made a sound that was not crying and not screaming, but something more primal than either the sound of a mother receiving back the thing she had already begun to grieve. Then she looked up at Elowen, at the girl she had pulled her son away from in the general store, at the girl whose name she had spoken with suspicion and whose presence she had treated as a threat. She reached up and took Elowen's hand. Her grip was fierce and her fingers were trembling, and her face was streaming with tears that froze in streaks on her cheeks. "Forgive me," she said. Elowen looked down at her. And then she did a thing that surprised everyone, including herself. She slid down from the horse, knelt in the snow beside the woman and her son, and put her arms around them both. She held them. The deaf girl who was not deaf, the silent girl who had found her voice, held a woman who had feared her, and a boy who had heard her calling his name through a blizzard, and the 3 of them knelt in the snow while the wind died and the clouds began to thin, and the first pale light of the afternoon broke through. After the boy was found, Brethren Creek changed, not overnight, not dramatically, the way snow melts in March, imperceptibly at first, then steadily, then all at once until the ground is bare, and you cannot remember what the white looked like. Orrin Polk brought venison to the ranch every week. He never said why. He simply appeared with the meat wrapped in cloth and hung it on the porch hook and tipped his hat and rode away. Odette Scholl came up the mountain twice a month and sat in the kitchen with Elowen and taught her to make sourdough bread, and in exchange, Elowen taught her which herbs to pick for headaches and which for fever and which for the ache in the joints that came with mountain winters. People left things at the gate: jars of preserves, knitted scarves, a pair of leather gloves too small for any of the brothers, just the right size for Elowen. No names attached, just offerings left like prayers in a language that did not require words. The children came first. They appeared one morning in a group of 4 ages ranging from 6 to 11, standing at the ranch gate with their hands in their pockets and their breath making clouds in the cold air. They had walked up from Brethren Creek without telling their parents, a 3-hour climb that left their cheeks red and their boots muddy because they had heard about the woman on the mountain who could hear things nobody else could, and they wanted to learn. Elowen taught them to listen. She took them to the meadow behind the house and told them to lie flat on the ground and press their ears to the earth. "What do you hear?" she asked. They heard rumbling, the underground stream, she told them, the water that runs through the mountain always even in winter. She took them to the stable and placed their hands on the horses' flanks and told them to close their eyes. "What do you feel?" she asked. They felt heartbeats. They felt breath. They felt the warmth of a living thing that was larger than themselves and patient in a way that humans rarely were. The youngest child, a girl named Sparrow who was 6 years old and shy as a field mouse, could distinguish between a mountain chickadee and a junco by the rhythm of the song alone by her fourth visit. The children came back every week, then twice a week. Their parents noticed changes. The children were quieter at home but not withdrawn. They listened more carefully. They watched more closely. They seemed to be paying attention to the world in a way they had not before, as if someone had taught them that the world was worth attending to. Nell Firth came to the ranch on a Tuesday morning in February. She climbed the trail alone in her good coat and her town boots, carrying a single item wrapped in brown paper. She found Elowen in the kitchen garden, turning over the frozen soil with a hand fork in preparation for the spring planting. They faced each other across the garden fence, two women separated by suspicion and silence, and the accumulated weight of words that should have been spoken months ago. Nell set the brown paper package on the fence post. Inside was a book, leather-bound spine, cracked pages, soft with handling. A book of poetry by a writer whose name Elowen did not recognize. "My daughter left this behind," Nell said. Her voice was dry and controlled, the voice of a woman who had spent her life managing other people's business and had never learned to manage her own grief. "She used to read to me from it every night before bed. She had a voice like water running over stones. She left 2 years ago. I do not know where she went. I do not know if she is alive." She paused. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes, gray and sharp, stayed fixed on Elowen's face. "I have not heard anyone read aloud in 2 years," she said. "Read to me." Elowen took the book. She opened it to the first page. She began to read in her rough, husky, broken voice, the voice of a woman who had been silent for 8 years and was still learning what her own words sounded like. And the words she read were someone else's words about loss and memory and the way that absence can fill a room more completely than presence ever could. Nell first stood by the garden fence with her eyes closed and her hands gripping the wooden rail and her face perfectly still, except for the tears that ran down her weathered cheeks in two steady lines that she did not wipe and did not acknowledge and did not try to stop. She came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. She never stayed more than 20 minutes. She never spoke about the church or the sermons or the whispers. She simply came and listened, and in the listening, something in her began to thaw. Pastor Creed did not come to the ranch. But one morning in late February, Elowen found a basket of apples at the gate wrapped in a checkered cloth with a small piece of paper folded inside. The handwriting was cramped and shaking the penmanship of a man whose hands were steadier delivering judgment than asking for grace. "When my daughter left, I had no one to hear me. I hated you because you could hear without trying, and I could not hear even when I begged." Elowen read the note twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the small wooden box on her dresser beside the faded blue handkerchief she had found under the bed. Her mother's silence and Fable's handkerchief and a pastor's confession. 3 relics of grief kept together in the dark. Spring came to the San Juan Mountains the way it always came, grudgingly. The snow retreated up the slopes by inches, leaving behind a landscape that looked raw and new. The creek ran high with snow melt. The aspens put out their first green buds. The meadow behind the house erupted in wildflowers, columbine, and Indian paintbrush, and a dozen varieties of grass that turned the brown hillside into something that looked from a distance like a quilt stitched by a generous hand. On a morning in early April, Ridley Dunmore sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter. It took him 3 hours. He filled 6 pages with handwriting that was careful and deliberate and occasionally crossed out and rewritten the penmanship of a man who wanted every word to carry the exact weight of what he meant. When he finished, he folded the pages and placed them in an envelope and set it on the kitchen table. Elowen found it that evening. She took it to the small room off the kitchen and sat on the bed and read it by candlelight. The letter did not propose marriage in the traditional sense. Ridley Dunmore was not a man who could write, "Will you marry me?" without feeling that the words were too small for what he was asking. Instead, he wrote about silence, about the 10 years he had spent inside it, building walls out of guilt and routine, and the belief that he did not deserve to hear a woman's voice in his house again because he had failed to save the last woman whose voice had lived there. He wrote about the morning he found Fable cold and still, and the expression on her face that he saw every night when he closed his eyes. He wrote about the letter he had sent to Nevada and how he had expected nothing, and how what had arrived was not nothing but everything. "I do not need you to speak," he wrote. "I do not need you to hear. I need you to stay. I need to know that when I sit on the porch in the evening and look at the mountains, you will be beside me. Not because you have nowhere else to go, but because you have chosen this place and these men and this life, and your choosing makes it real in a way that it has not been real since my mother died. I want to hear your heart if you will let me listen with mine." Ella Lowen read the letter 3 times. Then she held it against her chest and closed her eyes and stayed very still for a long time. And then she did something she had not done since the night her mother died. She took off her shoes. She set them beside the bed side by side, and she lay down and pulled the quilt to her chin, and she slept without them. For the first time in 8 years, she slept without her shoes on because shoes meant running, and she was done running. She had found the place where she could stop. In the morning, she came out to the porch. The sun was just clearing the eastern ridge, throwing long shadows across the yard and painting the peaks in shades of gold and rose. Ridley was sitting on the porch step with a cup of coffee in his hands that had gone cold. Beckett was at the chopping block, splitting wood with unnecessary vigor. Ansel was near the stable, brushing the bay mare with the exaggerated concentration of a man who was not thinking about a horse. All 3 of them were watching her. None of them were admitting it. Elowen walked down the steps and stood in front of Ridley. The morning light caught her hair, and her green eyes were bright, and her face held an expression that was new. Not the blank stillness of a girl who had trained herself to be invisible, but the open, trembling, courageous face of a woman who was about to do the most frightening thing she had ever done, which was not to speak, but to choose. "I will be your wife," she said. Ridley set down the coffee cup. His hands were shaking. Elowen turned to Beckett, who had stopped swinging the axe and was standing with the handle resting against his shoulder, and his face arranged in the expression of a man who was absolutely not emotionally affected by what was happening. Then she turned to Ansel, who had given up all pretense of brushing the horse and was standing with the brush in one hand and his heart in his eyes. "And I will be your family," she said to both of them, "because you are the first family I have ever chosen. Not the one I was born into, not the one I was sold to, the one I walked toward with my own feet and stayed with by my own will. You are the first people in my life who made silence feel like belonging instead of hiding." Beckett looked at the axe head. He looked at the skull. He looked at his boots. Then he looked at Elowen, and his face did something that his brothers had not seen it do in 10 years. It softened. The hard lines around his mouth eased. The tension in his jaw released. For 3 seconds, Beckett Dunmore looked like the 20-year-old boy he had been before he pulled a trigger and lost himself. And then the moment passed and the hardness returned, but not all the way. Never all the way again. The wedding took place on a Saturday in late April on the hilltop behind the ranch house beneath the old lodgepole pine that the 3 brothers had planted the week their mother died. The tree had grown tall and straight in the 10 years since its trunk, now thick as a man's thigh, its branches spreading wide enough to cast a circle of shade large enough for a small ceremony. There were more people than any of the brothers had expected. Odette Shaw came in her best dress. Orrin Polk rode up in a clean shirt, which was an event so unusual that Ansel later said it may have been the most surprising thing that happened all day. Sheriff Haddon Pratt came in his official capacity, wearing his badge and his good hat and standing at the back with his hands clasped. The children came, 8 of them walking up the mountain trail in a line like ducklings carrying fistfuls of wildflowers that they scattered on the path from the house to the hilltop. Sparrow the youngest carried a single columbine in both hands, holding it in front of her like a candle, and her face was so serious and so luminous that Ansel had to look away for a moment and pretend to adjust his hat. Martha Morrison came, the woman who had pulled her son away from Elowin in the general store, the woman who had knelt in the snow and asked forgiveness. She stood near the front and held her boy Whit on her hip, even though he was 7 and too old for carrying, and she held him because she could, because he was alive, because a girl who heard with her heart had walked barefoot through a blizzard to bring him back. Pastor Creed did not come to the wedding. But when Ridley and Elowin walked down the trail afterward, passing through Brethren Creek on their way back up the mountain, Creed was standing in the doorway of his church. His Bible was in his hand. His face was unreadable. Their eyes met across the muddy street, the girl who heard everything and the man who had tried to cast her out. Elowin nodded, a single nod, small and precise, the kind of nod that closes a chapter without tearing out the page. Creed nodded back. Ridley kissed Elowin beneath the lodgepole pine while the afternoon sun painted the mountains in shades of amber and violet. It was the first kiss for both of them, and it was brief and gentle, and witnessed by 40 people and 8 children and a 6-year-old girl holding a columbine. And when it ended, Elowin leaned close to Ridley's ear and spoke in a whisper that only he could hear. "I do not need sound," she said. Only you." Ridley pulled back and looked at her. His amber eyes, which had carried the weight of guilt and silence and loneliness for a decade, were clear. "I hear you," he said. "Always have." The months passed. They passed the way months pass on a mountain marked not by calendars, but by the angle of the light and the height of the grass and the slow migration of the snow lying up and down the peaks. Summer came and went. Autumn returned. The aspens turned gold again, and the air took on the sharp, bright quality that meant winter was thinking about coming back. Elowin taught the children sign language under the lodgepole pine every Saturday morning. She taught them the signs for water and fire, and thank you and good morning, the same signs Ridley had taught her, and the children learned them with the fearless speed of youth, and soon they were signing to each other across the schoolyard and at the dinner table and in church, which irritated Pastor Creed considerably, but which he did not have the moral standing to object to anymore. Beckett laughed. It happened on a morning when Elowin named the new ranch dog a brindled mutt that had wandered up the mountain trail and refused to leave. She named him Ruckus, and when she said it aloud, Beckett made a sound that started in his chest and worked its way up through his throat and came out of his mouth as an actual laugh, rough and rusty and short but real. Everyone looked at him. He stopped laughing and cleared his throat and picked up the axe, but the damage was done. He was capable of joy, and they had all witnessed it, and he could never fully rebuild the wall that the laugh had knocked a hole through. Ansel and Elowin rode the mountain trails together in the late afternoons when the light was golden and the shadows were long and the world was quiet in the way that only high places can be quiet. They rode side by side, not speaking, watching the hawks circle above the valley, and the silence between them was not the silence of 2 people who have nothing to say, but the silence of 2 people who have said everything that matters and are content to let the rest be carried by the wind. Ridley built a wooden bench beneath the cottonwood tree behind the house. It faced west toward the ridge where the sun set every evening. He and Elowin sat on that bench most evenings side by side, close enough that their shoulders touched, and they watched the light change, and they did not speak, and they did not need to. Sometimes Ridley brought out an old harmonica that had belonged to his father, a battered instrument with a tin casing and reeds that were slightly out of tune, and he played melodies that had no names. Tunes he had invented or half remembered or simply discovered by breathing into the instrument and letting his breath find the notes that wanted to be found. Elowen closed her eyes and swayed with the music. She heard every note. She had always heard every note, but she did not tell him because some truths are more beautiful when they remain unspoken, and the image of a man playing music for a woman he believed could not hear it playing it anyway because the playing was the point and not the hearing was a truth so beautiful that she would not disturb it with explanation. The following winter brought another storm. Another child wandered too far from home. And Elowen Dunmore knelt in the snow and pressed her palms to the frozen earth and pointed west. And the men of Brethren Creek did not hesitate. They did not question. They did not look at each other with doubt or fear. They simply followed her because they had learned what the three brothers on the mountain had known for months. The girl who heard with her heart had never once been wrong. They found the child. They always found the child. In the years that followed, the ranch on the north face of the mountain became something more than a ranch. It became a place where people came when they needed to be heard. Farmers came when their crops failed and sat on the porch and said nothing, and Elowen sat beside them and said nothing. And when they left, they felt lighter without being able to explain why. Mothers came when their children were sick. Cowboys came when their bones ached. Odette Shull came every Wednesday and sat in the kitchen and knitted and did not speak for an hour. And the hour was, she told anyone who asked, the best hour of her week. Elowen wrote on the chalkboard beside the front door every morning. She had done it since her first weeks on the ranch, weather observations and small practicalities. But now the notes had changed. Now they said things like, today will be good. I can feel it. She was wrong sometimes. Not every day was good. But most days she was right, and the people of Brethren Creek who had once whispered the word witch and carried their certainties to her gate like weapons now passed by the ranch on their way to town and looked up at the chalkboard and read her words and felt in a place too deep for logic that if Elwyn Dunmore said the day would be good, then perhaps it would be. On an evening in late October, 1 year after she had arrived at the ranch, Elowen stood on the hilltop beside the lodgepole pine and watched the sun drop behind the western ridge. The light was amber and lilac and fading, and the first stars were appearing above the peaks, and the air smelled of pine smoke and cold and the particular sweetness of grass that has been cut by frost. Ridley stood beside her. Below them in the yard, Beckett was stacking firewood against the side of the house, each piece placed with the same controlled force that he brought to everything, and Ansel was in the paddock brushing down the bay mare who had once been lame and wild and was now neither. The world was quiet, but it was not empty. Elowen turned to Ridley and she laughed. Not the small, careful laugh that she had learned to allow herself in the early months, but a real laugh. A sound that came from somewhere deep in her chest and rose through her throat and shook her shoulders and lit her face the way dawn lights a mountain suddenly and completely and with a beauty that cannot be rehearsed. It was the laugh of a woman who had walked through silence and fear and cruelty and come out the other side into something that felt like home. Ridley smiled and kissed her temple. Below them, Beckett paused with a piece of firewood in his hands and looked up, and his face did the thing it had been doing more often lately, the softening, the easing, the 3-second glimpse of the boy he was before the world hardened him. Ansel stopped brushing the mare and tilted his head, listening, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man hearing music in a place where he had been told there would be none. Elowen wrote on the chalkboard beside the door every morning. And every morning the words were the same 5 words that contained everything she knew about love and hope and the stubborn insistence of the human heart that tomorrow will be better than today. Today will be good. I feel it. And on the quiet slopes of the Colorado mountains where wind and silence speak in the same tongue, 3 brothers who had forgotten how to be heard and a girl the world called deaf discovered a language deeper than sound. A language of hands, of glances, of hearts that knew how to listen, and it was enough.